Good afternoon. I'm Linda Kenny Bodden. I'm here with my guest today, Mr. Mike Koribanics, a fellow New Jersey person. We're here to discuss the case that Vincent Hill was just discussing with you this morning, that you were listening to all day, this horrible case, really, in terms of the victims, where Amanda Tomashow is a victim of Larry Nasser, one of the many. The trial this morning was actually not a trial, but it was like a trial. It's a preliminary hearing, Mike, okay? It was a preliminary hearing where Luana Simon had her first glimpse of what a courtroom is like when the Michigan State University allegedly, through her, tried to stop or impede an investigation. At least that's what is being charged here. You've read about it, right?
Yeah, this is an introduction to a very long journey she's going to go on,
right,
with all these processes and hearings and things of that nature. But it's pretty devastating.
Yeah, but it's a devastating first step. But it's interesting because they have to charge that the statement she gave in the complaint and then the attached affidavit to the complaint, which we have because of Law&Crime here, we have everything. Okay, here it is, right here. That those statements, which were she wasn't aware of any prior investigation with Larry Nasser or of his quote misconduct, and then she said that she was aware of a sports medicine doc who was subject to review. They have to prove those specific statements were false and that they impeded the investigation for the felony count, correct?
That's correct, but it's like you said before, is, you know, everybody has a presumption of innocence, but it just doesn't ever seem real till you take that initial step and you're in the courtroom.
Did I say that? Did I say presumption of innocence? Yes, of course I did, because I'm a defense attorney. Of course I said presumption of innocence.
But in this instance, it's, you know, especially someone who's not been through the system, you know, this is someone who's used to the academic life, right, sort of the ivory tower kind of thing, not the things we go through every day and the rough and tumble world of the courtroom.
And what these young women went through for years was terrible. This was a sexual predator with like little kids.
It's a horrible situation because it's not only a predator, but this predator was given access by a major university, if these allegations are true, and they really put their
that people said, well, maybe they didn't occur, let's see a trial. And you have to have the presumption, but in this case, obviously, Larry Nasser is guilty. We don't know about Larry Harris. Anyhow, we're going to go to a clip of one of the victims, Amanda Tomashow, who was speaking to the court. The court ordered, whether she wanted it or not, that she could not be filmed, but we can listen to her.
So since you reported this in 2014, have you received anything from MSU?
I've received a bunch of phone calls asking for donations. I've gotten hundreds of nights of no sleep because of reoccurring nightmares, probably thousands of anxiety attacks, some so bad that I ended up having to go to the hospital. I now have about 12 bleeding ulcers in my digestive tract, as well, and I get ulcers in my mouth every time the MSU comes back into the headlines. So I have one right now. I have skin lesions, actually, every time I get really stressed. It's part of Crohn's, which is a disease that is tied to sexual assault. I can't be alone with men. I have anxiety attacks every time I go to the doctor. I've gotten back into abusive relationships because I hated myself, because I thought that I was wrong for years. The way that MSU treated me, silenced me, killed me. And I'm not the same person. So I have, that's what I've gotten in return for reporting.
Well, Mike Koribanics, that is the victim here in this specific case, Amanda Tomashow. We know there are a lot of them, but we're specifically focusing on this for the Luana Simon, not Harris, Simon preliminary hearing. Now, she is very eloquent, isn't she?
She's eloquent, and the way she describes it, it's the details, the way she describes being afraid to park on the top level of a parking lot because she fears she would drive off. And the one thing, too, is the thing that really struck me about that was when she spoke about trust, how, you know, when someone breaches your trust, the inability to trust in the future is such a long-lasting scar to these victims in these kind of cases. I was a former assistant prosecutor, right, in the sex crimes unit.
And I also was assigned to the sex crimes back in New Jersey.
And when you hear those little descriptions of trust, being afraid to look over the edge or park in a certain area. It's moving. It's very moving, and it really shows you how so much deeper it is than the physical. It's the emotional.
Wow, wow. This is one of the many cases that we are recovering today, and we are recovering from listening to her, obviously, and all of the victims who are victims, because Larry Nasser has pled guilty in that matter. We'll see whether Luana Simons, I don't know why I keep calling her Harris, will eventually go to trial. That continues April 9th, I believe. But, you know, today, Law&Crime has also been following in California the McStay case. The McStay case. You know that. It's another horrible crime. We don't know who did it yet, but the person that the state alleges who did it is on trial. His name is Chase. Charles is his real name. Merritt. And 4 family members were dead, found 3 years after they disappeared, over 3 years, in the Mojave Desert. That's a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a mom and a dad, the McStay family. Now, today in the courtroom was not a jury day. What the judge was listening to today were arguments. Attorneys do make those for the introduction, according to the state, of having a witness named Ryan Baker from QuickBooks testify that he received a call from somebody, a male, on February 10th, which is 6 days after the McStays were last seen, or at least Mr. McStay, Joseph, was last seen. And the person wanted to delete or eliminate or close the account. We don't know what, because he quite hasn't testified yet. And that's the issue. He is undergoing surgery. He cannot be there in California. The prosecution wants to use what is called a video deposition to interrogate him and then play it for the trial. We're going to go to the clip because the defense is arguing against it. So, Mike Koribanics, one of my favorite New Jersey people, you and Bob Bianchi, right? We used to meet in the courtroom. Here's the problem. This is a real bad witness for the defense, okay, considering all the rest have not really heard of. This says that somebody called from the defendant's phone, his phone, okay, on February 10th and wanted to either close out or do something with his QuickBooks, with Joseph McStay's QuickBooks account. So Joseph, obviously, is, you know, that would have to be the defense, the prosecution will say the killer, because no one else knew that he was dead. How do you counteract that?
This is very tough, because I think this judge, as you know, sometimes you know if a judge is a trial dog or not a trial dog. You know he's been around or hasn't, or if he's tried cases. Right. He's obviously tried cases, because I was listening to him. There were things going off in my head. All right, but how do you
counteract it? Forget him. It's like a good defense attorney.
I keep fighting him. I keep fighting him, but I think he's ultimately going to win.
Yeah, but here's what you can do.
I don't like the fact anytime I'm defending a client and a witness is somehow losing that connection with the jury, because I don't think Skype, I think Skype is probably the next best way to do it.
Well, let me ask you this. In a civil case, right, in a civil case, and where we practice most of, you can ask the judge for a regular deposition before the video deposition that's going to go before trial. They apparently don't have that in California. Would that remedy the problem defense is complaining about?
Well, I don't do civil work, because my idea of civil work is if you send me interrogatories, you win.
That's questions you have to ask on paper, okay, or an answer.
But in this situation, I just think that, you know, any crucial witness, you lose the flavor, number one. And you know, Linda, when you're trying a case, you get a feel for the jury.
Right.
And you're going to ask questions differently. Right. So if you're asking questions outside the presence of the jury you have, then you really don't know how they're reacting, and it's very difficult. And I would just do whatever I could to keep this testimony out without him appearing. I really thought it was a clever move by the defense when they fought the declaration to even get there.
Right.
And I think they may have an issue there.
And what you're talking about is the declaration is from this person who's allegedly sick, right? Can't come and says, I'm too sick to travel without any backup, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You know what? On that note of correct, because we love saying yes, especially when you say yes to me, I love it, we have to do something called a little break. And so we're going to go there and we'll be back. Case for the death, Michael Koribanics, of her 4-month-old child who basically starved to death, right? And didn't, no care, no nothing. I can't even go through the forensic entomology testimony here. But this morning, the defense had a a PhD in clinical psychology, not social work, PhD in clinical psychology, who at the University of Iowa runs this program for postpartum depression. And he said that indeed mom had postpartum depression, she had severe addiction, severe drug addiction, and she also had a PTSD. This doctor comes in who interviews her, it says in jail, and concludes, it's going to conclude that she's fine, that she knew what she was doing. What do you say? How do you attack that, given the facts in this case are so terrible?
Given that the facts in this case are so terrible, I would have really thought twice about putting my own expert on, because this expert, I think, is really, really good. I mean, I love when
he's at the same college, University of Iowa, right?
And I love when you see an expert who doesn't have notes or refer to his notes, because I think that tells a jury this expert's prepared. And he has a very nice conversational tone, and he's really speaking to logic that, you know, like depression's universal. And you put on a defense specific, I don't think many people could relate to it. And I think it's dangerous.
I agree with you. I think that the defense was trying to give something to a little thing. But I suspect there's something else going on here with this kid. Because why would Nala be fine? Why would the dog be fine and this kid not taken care of? And remember, and I don't know this for a fact, but remember the meth dealer who had an affair with her after Sterling died? And there was a DNA test with the father to make sure it's his son. I suspect that there was some indication or some thoughts that maybe this was somebody else's child, and that's what was going on here. Because it doesn't make any sense.
None of it makes sense. It's so scary. It's almost like something you can't even. It's true because you couldn't make it up.
Yeah, but here this doctor says he interviewed her in jail. In jail, is that good for the defense or bad?
Well,
why would he say pause?
Because it's always a question. Sometimes you may want the jury to know your client's in jail.
Right.
In a situation where you think your client's been wronged or something's unjust. But, you know, jurors are not like jurors 20 years ago, right. 30 years ago.
Even 10 years ago.
People know now with shows like Law and Crime,
right.
They're very educated. So they know someone who's done such a heinous crime more than likely is being incarcerated and held pending the trial. Yeah. So I don't know if it's that big of a issue, and I'm sure they might have thought it out and, said, maybe better we don't object, let them bring it out and let them know. And I think maybe they can use that to attack him. Because, in New Jersey at least, unless you have established the doctor-client relationship,
sure, right.
you can't even prescribe. Right. You can't prescribe over the internet. You can't prescribe over the phone. You have to have that face-to-face.
See, but the normal attacks here, you always basically work for the prosecution. You've done 30 cases, 14 you testified. Those normal attacks don't work here. And you know why, ladies and gentlemen? Because this is such a horrible case, and everybody is so offended with what happened to this child. So we're going to need a little time to recover, Mike and I. So we're going to go to a quick break, and then we'll be back. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Linda Kenny Bott, and as you know, we have been in the trial, the last trial, one of 3 today, maybe even 4, of Cheyenne Harris, whose 4-month-old child with her lover and live-in boyfriend and significant other, Zachary, died because he wasn't fed, because he wasn't changed, because the maggots were all over the skin that was dying because of blood. It's so awful you can't even talk about it, and that's the problem of having a jury hear this kind of evidence, isn't it, Michael?
Yeah, this is very bad. This is very bad type of evidence, and I think there was we heard a brief cross-examination,
which we're going to play for everybody. So don't go away.
And I think sometimes a seasoned trial attorney realizes that there's just some witnesses you don't get into a fight with because you get them off the stand because they've really hurt you in direct, and get him off the stand instead of having him repeat the answers that hurt you again.
Well, it hurts because he's repeating all the horrible things, but then the defense did catch him, and we're going to replay this on one issue because Dr. Dennard, who was the psychiatrist for the state, didn't do a report, didn't take notes that were exact. They were kind of sort of verbatim of what the defendant said, what the witness said about the death, and made it seem like she was saying something that was actually something that you think in retrospect to try to think about once you have been in jail because you've gone off the drugs, gotten treatment for your PTSD, and no longer have to take care of any responsibility, right? So it's different at that point.
It's different, but in the direct, in the voir dire of him as to his credentials, things
that
of that
means the
nature.
questioning as to his credentials, right?
It sort of comes back to what you're saying, and it loops back. I thought it was interesting that he said, I usually interview people who it's difficult to interview because they're there to try to get over, basically, that they have charges. They're not as honest as a person who comes in off the street seeking help. I'm there to test them. And I think that sort of is like an undertone of all this, is that she's not being honest to anybody here because she's trying to get out from under her horrible deed.
Yeah, except that she talked to the police. I mean, she told them everything. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, she spoke to the police. She's been speaking all over the place. Apparently, they played her tapes. I think the defense, quite frankly, is just going for a look at this woman who got with the wrong guy, who's a meth addict, a terrible drug addict. She's got all these problems. She had postpartum depression, and something went wrong, and we don't know what, jury. Okay? So we're going to go back and replay some of the testimony that happened this morning before we go to the cross-examination of Dr. Denner, because it'll put it more in perspective. And this was Michael O'Hara. He's a postpartum depression expert. He has a PhD in psychology, clinical psychology, and he runs a clinical psychology program about this at the University of Iowa, where it's the same place the prosecution expert works. Let's listen to what Dr. O'Hara had to say.
Did you eventually arrive at a diagnosis or diagnoses for Ms. Harris?
Yes. So there were really 3 diagnoses that seemed to capture her mental condition. One was major depression at a severe level, recurrent with what we call peripartum onset, which simply means the beginning, an episode that begins during pregnancy or early in the postpartum period. Second diagnosis was post-traumatic stress disorder, or what's often called PTSD. And the third diagnosis was essentially substance abuse, severe, with stimulant medication, methamphetamine in particular.
Now let's talk about those a little bit out of order.
Well, that's a brief glimpse into the defense psychologist, Dr. Michael O'Hara, who said that something that we all suspected, and we know that her record shows she had postpartum depression after little Sterling was born, that she had PTSD, which is, no matter how bad you are, you may have it if something bad happens, and that she had severe drug addiction. And we heard from the reading of her husband's testimony from his first trial that he actually gave her the meth. Do you think, Mike Koribanics, my soulmate from New Jersey, that indeed the fact that the husband gave her the meth, and his transcript was read before the jury this morning because he's got a Fifth Amendment privilege not to testify again, right, that will help maybe reduce her charges? I don't know, Mike. You're not acting like a defense attorney to me.
I always like to evaluate my client to tell them if maybe we shouldn't go to trial and we should resolve the issue. I just don't think, there's always, as we know, it's like cross-examining a cooperating witness against your client. You better watch how much you beat him up or her up, because they're going to always say at the end is, well, that's who your client was hanging around with. So, and the law takes that into consideration.
Right.
The ingestion of drugs, regardless of what your beliefs are in addiction, under the law is a voluntary act.
And in New Jersey, that would not be a defense, as it is here in Iowa. If you have a voluntary intoxication, that would not be a defense at all. But it still would go possibly, not as a defense, it would still go to a jury if a jury wants to reduce charges to what she was capable. But she's taking care of the dog.
That's a problem. I think that's the problem, number one. But number two is, I think that argument really would go to the judge at sentencing to see if he can give any kind of discretion. I think there's some kind of this is real tough here if you get convicted of this. I mean, Zachary didn't even get the get out of jail card that you do in Monopoly. I mean, nothing. Boom, away he went, as well he should, because he also had a responsibility, Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And there's something here though, and we're going to hear it again. There's something going on in both doctors. There's something not quite right with this situation. Everything else is taken care of, but this poor little child who just, apparently the mother and the attorney were sick when the forensic entomologist, not entomologist, entomologist, the bug guy, testified. It's so bad. How can anything overcome it?
I don't know how it can. I really don't.
So that's interesting. So you would have just pled guilty and put yourself on the mercy of the court, or do you take the shot because that's all you've got?
Well, sometimes you don't have any choice. I mean, we've all been in that situation where they won't accept the plea of guilty. As we know, in most states, the prosecutors aren't obligated to give you a plea deal.
But
So
you know what gets me?
choice.
If she gets convicted, she could go for jail for the same amount of time that we have a case going on in federal court right now in Brooklyn called El Chapo, a major drug dealer who killed a lot of people. The same amount of time as he could. Life! How is that fair in the law? If you want to talk of the whole perspective, or is it fair because they kill people? She killed people, and we have to hear about El Chapo's verdict yet.
It's one of those things where the disparities are so great, you just don't. There's no simple answer to complex questions.
So we have to go to a hard break. You know what that means? It's a little tiny break, but we will be back at the back end of this to hear more on the Cheyenne Harris case. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm Linda Kenny Bodden. I'm here today with Mike Koribanics. We have been listening with bated breath, really, in the very sad case, Cheyenne Harris from Iowa, who is charged with the murder of her four-month-old. Wow, actually, it's 1 day minus 4-month-old child, Sterling, who just died a terrible death. Earlier today, defense started their case with the presentation of a clinical psychologist, not a psychiatrist, psychologist in postpartum depression. And I want you to listen because maybe you don't think it's important for this case, but in 15% of childbirths, women have postpartum depression, and in a lesser amount, postpartum psychosis, which is really awful. So it's a very big problem we have to deal with. It may not be relevant here. It may be relevant. Let's listen to what Dr. O'Hara told this jury.
Around the time that she began to suffer this sexual abuse that she had reported, and it sort of cycled on and off for many years. And for various episodes, it was very clear from her report that she had most, or if not all, of the symptoms of depression, including making very serious plans to kill herself at one point. So it was a pretty easy diagnosis to make. It was also corroborated, at least on one occasion, in the medical record.
Not the first time that diagnosis has been applied to her.
That's correct.
Now, let me ask you, what is the significance then of, we have major depressive disorder and then recurrent?
So recurrent simply refers to the fact that the diagnosis isn't the first time it's occurred, that we would have seen similar episodes in the past. So one of the things that we understand about depression is that these episodes for many people come and go, sometimes at a very severe level, other times not so severe. Sometimes there's complete recovery from a depressive episode, but many individuals experience repeated episodes throughout their lifetime.
Sterling?
Well, I mean, Nala was was almost 2 years old at this time. And a child of that age is mobile, is able to speak, express herself in Nala's case. And so I wouldn't say she's not going to fend for herself, but she can make her needs known to her parents. Sterling, on the other hand, as an infant, could cry, but there really wasn't much else that he could do. So it's not terribly surprising that Nala would not have been affected as much, but I would not argue that she was unaffected by all of this. There was an evaluation done of her, and it was pretty clear that there were significant problems that were identified by the social workers who did that evaluation. And I don't mean physical per se, but psychological.
And
Well, Mike, I mean, you know, no matter what you think of this woman, this is trash. This doctor said, this documented in the medical record, she had over sexual abuse. She wanted to kill herself and commit suicide, which was corroborated over the time. She also had the postpartum depression. There was meth in this child's umbilical cord. They got sent home, and then she didn't follow up. Does that in any way mitigate maybe what the jury will do with her versus what it did with Zachary, who seemed fine?
Well, I mean, this is really horrible because it seems, even when you watch as the doctor's testifying, if you watch her, her head is dropped, her hair's covering her face. I mean, she's reliving this again. I mean, it appears she was released from the hospital with no sort of support. I mean, we're all interconnected in our lives, and for her to go after such a traumatic type of event and have no support system, you could see how things may have spiraled out of control.
Her family didn't like Zachary, from what we heard first. They didn't want her around him, but she went with him. He didn't want them around her. They weren't allowed to come into her house. I mean, you don't know what could have been, but what could have been is a child could have lived who would have been already born.
Well, you know, you're pointing out so many things that are so interconnected and interrelated, and it just seems this whole tragedy was like the perfect storm.
Okay, well, let me stop you. Let me stop you. I'm going to challenge you here. You know why? Because the neighbor said later on, or we heard from the tapes this morning that we heard, that she had told Zachary, why don't we just get Nala, or why don't I just get Nala and run after, you know, the police were about to be called or being called. So does that make her someone who's tragic, or does that make her somebody who wants to escape the law if the jury hears that? That's why I'm putting that in there.
And we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about the law, which the law really has no room for, in the most part, when we're in a, you know, trial's finding facts, not finding emotion.
Oh, that's an interesting. I kind of like that. I'm going to have to put that in my repertoire. Finding facts, not emotion. But it is finding emotion, though, isn't it, Michael?
Well,
in the real life.
We try to put things into a contextual sort of surrounding where we can understand everything. I mean, listen, there is nothing to excuse. Like I always say, someone may have mental problems, and they may become a serial killer, and they may have all sort of reasons why that occurred. That doesn't help the victims.
But the victims here are the child and then the other child, Nala. Nala's 4 years old. She is going to grow up really without having this loving relationship with her parents. They may still love her, but they could be loving her from jail. So she's also a victim. What do we do about that? I mean, what do we do about that here?
You're
getting upset, and you are, my point is, you are a seasoned defense attorney, and you're getting upset. So you have a jury that hasn't heard things like maggots, hasn't heard things like starving to death, hasn't heard things like, you know, what they're hearing about this child. If you can't deal with it, how do they deal with it? And how do they deal with it after this trial? Don't they have PTSD?
Oh, nobody comes in. This is such collateral damage. It just keeps rolling and rolling. I mean, you're talking about grandparents are involved. Mm-hmm. Grandparents who obviously there was some, everybody will be looking in their rearview mirror to see how this could be avoided, and that'll never change.
Yeah, Mike, I just, you know, I don't know. I mean, it just, look at her, what a tragedy for this child. Anyhow, we have another clip, but it's very important. This is the neighbor, and her name is Jennifer Shriver, and she saw Zachary right after Sterling had died. I want to re-listen to her. How about you?
I would like to.
Let's